So I'm going to talk about composition at the same level. And here's a brief outline of my presentation. And yes, I'm going to start by talking a little bit about levels. So the traditional, the classical view about levels starts with Oppenheim and Putnam's very influential paper, The Unity of Science as a Working Hypothesis. And so they suggest these 6 levels, from elementary particles to social groups. And not only are, so the idea is that things at one level are entirely composed of things at the immediate level below. And not only that, but these are explicitly reductive levels. So the idea is that anything at one level can be explained in terms of things at the immediate level below. And eventually, everything will one day be explained in terms of elementary particles. So there are a number of problems with this view. And the first problem is reductionism itself. So micro-reductionism is not really, at least this very simple and straightforward micro-reductionism that they suggest is not really accepted anymore. Things are a bit more complicated than that. And we certainly don't think that we can explain, for example, the behavior of human beings in terms of elementary particles. Then another problem is their assumption of stepwise compositional continuity. And that means that anything at one particular level needs to have a complete decomposition in terms of things at the immediate level below. And that just seems to me to be obviously false. So for example, if you consider molecules, so molecules are made of atoms, but they can also have, for example, additional electrons. So, and those are elementary particles. So stepwise compositional continuity does not seem acceptable. And a third assumption they make is that there's going to be this very strict correspondence between nature and domains of science. And in reality, we know that there's a lot more overlap. So for example, we have things like biochemistry and molecular biology that bring together, in this case, chemistry and biology, but we also have disciplines that bring together sort of domains of science that are not seen to be immediately adjacent, like biology and physics. And then you have things like cognitive science and complexity science, which can really study very different domains of reality. As we saw in the previous talk, complexity science can apply to physical systems, but also to international migration and so on. So because of these problems, some people like Angela Potocznik, for example, have argued that we should eliminate or at least de-emphasize the use of levels in scientific and philosophical discourse, because the world is not really stratified into hierarchical levels, and talking of levels is somewhat misleading. But other people defend the use of levels by arguing that actually, if you look at scientific practice, you'll find that levels have at least heuristic value, and so they should continue to be used. But this is going to result in a pluralistic view, because actually levels in science are used in a variety of different ways. So to give you some examples, just from biology, you have, for example, anatomical levels, where you have cells, tissues, organs, organ systems, and then organisms. In evolutionary biology, you have levels of selection, because natural selection doesn't just apply to individual organisms, but it can act on things that are below the level of the organism, like genes or cell lineages, and also things above it, like populations and even species. There's also this traditional hierarchy of ecological levels, where again you find some things below the organism and some things above it, like populations, communities, and ecosystems. And even within ecology, you also find some levels in more restricted domains, like, for example, trophic levels that represent the position of an organism in a food web. And you also find levels in even more restricted domains, like, for example, the 4 levels of protein structure, where you have the amino acid sequence, and then you have some folding due to hydrogen bonds, and then you have the 3D structure, and then you have a 4th level where several polypeptides bind together to make a larger protein. So if you look at the science and you focus on the heuristic value of levels, that is going to result in a pluralistic view. But I was wondering if perhaps there might be a way to maintain a notion of ontological levels that is associated with the idea of the unity of science, while at the same time avoiding the problems of the classical view. And I think it's possible to do that if we try to bring together 2 different strands of thought. So one is the connection between levels and natural kinds. So Wimsatt, for example, says that levels comprise local maxima of regularity and predictability. And he says that whatever levels are, they're at least major vertebrae among the joints of nature, which is clearly alluding to natural kinds. And even more explicitly, Thomas Ryden has recently argued that natural kinds are located at levels of organization, and in turn, levels are characterized by kinds. And another strand of thought that I think is important here is thinking of levels in terms of scale. Now, James Lademan and Don Ross have argued for the scale relativity of ontology, which means that different things exist at different scales. So, for example, at the quantum scale, there are no cats. And they suggest that we should abandon talk of levels and use scale instead. And a very similar suggestion is made by Angela Potocznik and McGill, which is that that scale is an alternative to levels. But this quote suggests that the problem might not be so much with levels per se, but with universal and discrete hierarchical levels. So maybe there might be an alternative view that avoids those problems. And what I suggest is that we should instead understand ontological levels as main ontological regions on a continuous spatiotemporal scale. And those regions are going to be regions of major clustering of natural kinds. So you have, for example, fundamental particles, you have chemical elements, chemical compounds, different kinds of organisms, and so on. This is not meant to be an exhaustive list. And here we are avoiding the problems of microreductionism. We're not assuming that there is stepwise decomposition, stepwise compositional continuity, sorry. And there is some correspondence between domains, between these levels in nature and domains of science, but it's not strict correspondence. So there's a lot of overlap. So at one of these levels, we find organisms. And I take it that organisms are living objects. So organisms are objects that have the essential property being alive. Now, life is somewhat ambiguous because it can apply to the lives of individual organisms, or it can also apply to what Ruiz Mirazo and Alvaro Moreno call the historical collective phenomenon of life. So, for example, in NASA's definition of life, which is a self-sustaining chemical system capable of Darwinian evolution, that is clearly something that does not apply directly to individual organisms, because individual organisms are not by themselves capable of Darwinian evolution. So that applies to populations and lineages. But here we're going to be interested in the lives of individual organisms instead. So what is an organism? So Eric Olson suggests that part of what makes something a living organism is its capacity to coordinate and regulate its metabolic and other vital functions. And Matthew Liao says something very similar. He says that an organism exists as long as it has the capacity to regulate and coordinate metabolic and other life processes. Now, both of these suggestions already assume that there are vital processes going on. So I think perhaps we'd like to say that an object is alive if and only if it has the capacity to engage in and coordinate its own life processes. And these life processes include, first and foremost, metabolism, which I agree with Margaret Bowden that is really essential to life. But they can also include other processes like repair, maintenance, energy acquisition and storage, growth, reproduction, and so on. And I'm going to want to distinguish between simple and composite organisms. So obviously all organisms are composite objects, but simple organisms are not composed of any parts that are themselves alive. So for example, a bacterium is a good example of a simple organism, whereas composite organisms are composed of parts that are themselves alive. And an example is multicellular organisms. So there's a parallel here with Godfrey Smith's definition of simple and collective reproducers. So he says he defines simple reproducers as objects that can give rise to more objects of the same kind, largely through their own biological machinery, and that are not made of smaller parts that also reproduce. Whereas collective reproducers are reproducing objects that have parts that are themselves reproducers. But my notion of simple and composite organisms is a bit broader because it's not strictly about reproduction, it's about life in general. And well, you can have organisms that don't reproduce, obviously. And I'd like to push back against this idea that you find in discussions of biological individuality, that an adult higher animal is somehow a paradigm of biological individuality, and that we tend to assess the individuality of other kinds of organisms in comparison to this paradigm. And on the contrary, I'd like to suggest that unicellular prokaryotes, like bacteria, are the true paradigm biological individuals, because they're simple organisms that are not composed of anything else that is also alive. Whereas all eukaryotes, even unicellular ones, are already composite organisms. So I'd like to introduce the biological special composition question, but first let's start with the original special composition question. So this was already discussed yesterday by Michael de Vrucht, so I'm not going to dwell on it, but basically it's about when is there a case of composition. And Van Inwagen, as you might recall, is not a nihilist, but he's a minimalist about composition. So he thinks there's only one case in which composition occurs, and that's when there is a living organism. But that's not at all what I want to discuss. What I want to discuss instead is the biological special composition question. So assume that the X's and the Y are organisms. When is it true that there exists a Y such that the X is composite? Or in other words, when do some organisms compose another organism? And my answer to this question is going to be actually very similar to Van Inwagen's reply to the special composition question. I'm going to say that some organisms compose another organism when their combined activities constitute a life over and above the lives of the individual organisms. I call this organismal composition, and I think that this kind of composition happens at the same level. Now, why do I think that organismal composition happens at the same level? Well, because organisms can compose other organisms while still being themselves alive, while still being themselves living organisms. So if you think about molecules, for example, you can have two molecules and you can join them together and make a new molecule. But the two molecules don't continue to exist as molecules themselves. Now you just have the larger molecule that is composed of atoms and possibly subatomic particles. But in the case of organisms, you can have both cases. So you can have cases of fusion where two or more organisms fuse together to produce a new organism, but in the process, they cease to exist as organisms. And that's what happens, for example, at fertilization. But you can also have cases of organismal composition, where a number of organisms compose a new organism, but also continue to exist themselves as individual organisms. And an example of this is multicellularity. But there's actually a number of ways, well, four actually, that I can think of, to build a composite organism. So the first one to evolve was endosymbiosis. So at the origin of the eukaryotic cell, there was an archaea cell which engulfed a bacterial cell, and that bacterial cell evolved into the mitochondria that well, do the respiration and provide energy to eukaryotic cells. And in a separate endosymbiotic event, a cyanobacterium was also engulfed and evolved into the chloroplasts that exist in all algae and plants. So in this case, it's, I think, obvious that the eukaryotic cell is an organism, or that eukaryotic cells are organisms. But what about the mitochondria and the chloroplasts? Are they themselves organisms? Well, clearly at the beginning they were, but what about now, after all this evolution? Well, I think there are good reasons to think so. So for example, they have their own DNA, they have their own protein synthesis machinery, their membranes. So they're like little cells inside the cell. And they also divide largely independently from the cell cycle. But on the other hand, their gene expression is partly controlled by the cell, and there has been some significant genome reduction, and some of their genes have been transferred to the nucleus. But this reduction and this transfer varies a lot between lineages. So I think it's possible that actually we might say that mitochondria and chloroplasts are still organisms in some eukaryotic lineages, but possibly not in others, definitely not in the ones where they are very significantly reduced. But I think a good reason to think that that at least most of them might be organisms, is that there are cases of survival of mitochondria and chloroplasts in alternative host cells. So for example, there are some organisms that ingest algae and digest them, but keep the chloroplasts for themselves. And the chloroplasts continue to function and continue to, well, be alive for long periods of time. So another way to build a composite organism is through aggregation. And that's the case of slime molds. So in this case, you have a lot of individual cells, unicellular organisms that live independently. And then when food is scarce, they aggregate in their thousands and produce these structures, which are called slugs, which then move and eventually find a nice spot and produce these fruiting bodies, which are reproductive structures. And here the cells are clearly individual organisms, but the aggregate slug also exhibits purposeful behavior. It can move, it can orient towards light, and there might be even some self-sacrifice of some cells in favor of the group, in the sense that the cells that form the stalk don't actually get to reproduce. So we might say that the slime mold slug has at least some limited organismality. Now, obviously, the most well, familiar example of composite organisms are multicellular organisms. And multicellular organisms have evolved a variety of mechanisms for coordination of life processes. So, for example, they have cell-to-cell communication, vascular and circulatory systems, hormones that control cell behavior, nervous systems, particularly in animals, and there are a lot of developmental controls as well, especially the unicellular bottleneck, the separation between germ and soma, and at least in animals, I think, the maternal control of development. And yet another way to build a composite organism is through cloning and coloniality, as seen here in the example of siphonophore colonies like the Portuguese man of war. And here the zooids are individual metazoan organisms that arise through cloning from a single fertilized egg. But then they differentiate, and different zooids are going to specialize in food capture, digestion, locomotion, reproduction, etc. Sort of like the organs in a multicellular organism. And there's even a colony nervous system that coordinates locomotion and even initiates behavior. So there are good reasons to think that the colony itself is an organism, even though the zooids are also themselves organisms. So I'd like now to consider a few objections to the idea of organismal composition. And one is that someone might say that there are no composite organisms because they might simply equate organism with multicellular organism. But first of all, that's not how organism is used in biology. And in fact, it excludes most of the organisms that ever lived, which were unicellular organisms. And there's simply no good reason to restrict organism in this way. As Sumiro Kasha argues, it's difficult to see the rationale for designating some of these entities as organisms, but not others. And so we should instead adopt a rank-free approach. Someone might also think that there are no composite organisms because they might simply stipulate that whenever you have several living objects, only the largest one counts as an organism. But again, this seems like an unprincipled requirement. And if we deny that cells in a multicellular organism are themselves organisms, even though they're functionally comparable to independent unicellular organisms, then either we must deny that organisms are a natural kind defined by the essential property being alive, or we have to specify a new kind, living non-organism, just to apply to those organisms that are themselves part of other organisms. And I don't think that either of those options is very attractive. Another objection might be that, okay, there is organismal composition, but it doesn't happen at the same level. And that's a coherent view, and it makes some sense because biologists do talk about levels of organization all the time. But first of all, levels of organization in biology are not exactly ontological levels. In fact, as we saw in the first section, they can refer to all sorts of different things. But most importantly, there are lots of biological generalizations that can apply across simple and composite organisms, unicellular, multicellular, and so on. So for example, metabolic scaling laws can apply all the way from mitochondria to large mammals. Also, laws relating the efficiency of light absorption to chlorophyll A density in photosynthetic tissues apply all the way from cyanobacteria to very large trees. And so it makes more sense to think that all of these organisms are actually at the same level, because we want to apply these generalizations to them and we want to compare them. Now, some people find it very strange to say that, for example, blue whales and yeast cells should be located at the same level, because on the one hand, they're clearly organisms, but on the other hand, they have really different properties. But I don't think that that's a very compelling objection, because different multicellular organisms also have very different properties, like blue whales and oak trees. And at the same time, all organisms also share many properties just in virtue of being alive. And finally, someone might argue that, well, composite organisms are not really entirely composed of other organisms. So for example, Van den Wagen says that many of the simples that are caught up in my life are not caught up in the lives of any of my cells, for example, those in the blood plasma. But more than that, you might have some parts of the organism that are actually completely metabolically inert. So for example, a mollusk shell or mammal hair or tree bark are completely metabolically inert. And yet, because they were produced by the organism as part of its own life processes, I think that they should still be considered part of the organism. But that's not really a problem for organismal composition, I think. So instead, we can just say that composite organisms are composed of simpler organisms, plus their dead remains and other materials produced by them, or even acquired from the environment. And what's important is that the life of the composite organism emerges from the combined activities of the organisms that compose it. And so you have organismal composition. So to conclude, I've argued that ontological levels can be understood as regions of clustering of natural kinds on a continuous spatiotemporal scale. Organisms are located at one of those levels, and there are many ways of being an organism. So organisms can be simple, or they can be composite, which means that they're made of other organisms. And composite organisms can also be unicellular, multicellular, colonial, and I guess this could go on. And I've also argued that organismal composition is a case of composition that takes place at the same level, organisms composing organisms. Now, just to conclude, why do I think it's important to think about organismal composition? So composite organisms include multiple organisms. And multiple organisms mean that there are multiple lives present, and so multiple deaths as well. So for example, every day some of our cells die, and yet we remain alive. And it's also possible for the multicellular organism to die even while some of its cells remain alive. So I think that thinking in terms of organismal composition can help us better understand the problems of identifying the beginning and the end of the life of multicellular organisms such as ourselves. So here are some references, and thank you very much.